So World War II, there's so much that could be said about World War II. There's absolutely no way I could ever possibly cover everything about World War II, and honestly, I'm not even going to try. So I've kind of condensed a bunch of stuff into a list of big battles and military actions. Although my husband, who's kind of a military history uh, person, would argue that this is not nearly big enough. But from my perspective, as somebody who's more of a social and cultural historian, these are the battles that have kind of big impacts. And really pretty much there's all kinds of resources on YouTube that run through the different battles and can kind of tell you about that. And if there's any one in particular you want to know, I'll tell you. Pearl Harbor, of course, most important, gets us into the war. Midway is kind of the turning of the tide. Japan goes on the defense. D-Day, of course, the invasion of France. You're going to have the Battle of the Bulge, which is kind of the beginning of the end of the war. Iwo Jima, just because it's a horrific battle. And then you're going to have the atomic bombs. And then you've got issues like the Holocaust, of course. And the Holocaust is not just Jews. I want to point out that there's Asian genocides happening. The Japanese do terrible things to the Chinese, to the Korean, to the Vietnamese. There's, the Korean women are forced into sexual slavery as comfort women. And the Japanese, really don't acknowledge that. Chinese women would basically be chained down and raped until they died. So there's pretty, the Japanese did horrific things. I think the difference between the Japanese genocides or the Japanese actions that tried to commit genocide is that they don't really keep records, whereas the Germans had all those records, right? So with the Japanese, and the Japanese behavior is it's much more as a part of the war, instead of in the German sense, which is it's a systematic, like it's a whole thing, right? Like it's a whole part of the government. Whereas with Japan, it's very much connected with military action. Doesn't make it better. It just makes it different. So I do kind of want to point that out. We have a series of alliances and conferences, most important being you have an Atlantic Conference in the fall of 1941 before Pearl Harbor, where the U.S. and Great Britain essentially agreed to be, best friends and have each other's back. And this is before the U.S. is in the war. They even start talking about what they want the world to look like when the fighting's done. Again, before we're even in the war. And you have then eventually the Yalta Conference, which kind of divides Germany, makes plans for the end of the war. And then the Potsdam Conference, which is kind of where the U.S. knows about the atomic bomb. And the Cold War really begins in the Potsdam Conference with the tensions between Truman and Stalin and that kind of thing. So I'm not going to go into all of that. I've got a whole series of pictures that just kind of depict all kinds of things. The big thing that I want to talk about are the domestic consequences. Domestic consequences have to do with issues for African Americans, the idea of, them serving in the war, the Tuskegee Airmen, the integration of the military bases. And this is going to be kind of the big, kind of the beginning of the civil rights movement, if you will. For women, women go from kind of this very kind of quiet period of the Great Depression to, significant activity in World War II. Rosie the Riveter, right? Women participating in production and economic growth, taking on those roles while the men are off fighting. And if they couldn't work in the factories, they were keeping people's kids. Women were actively engaged in rationing and kind of volunteer work and growing gardens and you name it. You have women as official parts of the military, not auxiliary corps, but official parts of the military. So the Women's Army Corps, the WWIIs, which are the women's Naval Corps. I'm not sure exactly what all the acronym is, but you have that being a big deal. You have Latinos volunteering to serve in the military despite the deportations of the Great Depression. The Bracero program that basically is like this open visa program that welcomes Mexican immigrants to take over to help fill in some of the jobs that are needed. And it's out of this service and out of these actions that you're going to have the League of United Latin American Citizens and the American GI Forum, which fights for Latino veteran rights. Japanese Americans will be targeted in Executive Order 9066, basically put in concentration camps during this period. And they will, some of them will serve in the military, right? They'll send them to Europe. But so that's a pretty sad part of the story. And of course, women are tangled up in that as well. Navajo code talkers, volunteerism, the Victory Gardens, scrap drives, all that kind of stuff. And really what you're going to see is a true recovery from the Depression and full employment. For the first time and ever, the South finally becomes industrialized, becomes a part of manufacturing. And then, of course, there'll be this post-war boom. So when the soldiers come home, the women will then leave the factories and they'll go home and they'll make babies. And this ushers in kind of that 1950s period. So yeah, just some pictures, join the wax, keep them flying. A lot of that. And the big thing I think is that it's the same kind of action that we saw in World War I, but on to the nth degree. It's way more women getting involved in all of this. The war's over. Victory in Europe Day is May 8th, 1945. Victory in Japan Day is August 15th. FDR wins a fourth time in 1944, but dies in 1945. And it's into this that you have the dropping of the atomic bomb and that sort of thing. And so World War II will result in the U.S. being a superpower, and you'll have several years where we're the only power with an atomic bomb. But this will also kind of usher in the problems of the Cold War and some of those issues. And of course, this is an iconic picture. And then we don't even know who that nurse is or who that sailor is. So consequences of World War II, it lays the foundation of the world as we know it. And particularly in relation to the Cold War, the U.S. really becomes a world leader in a way that under imperialism we weren't, right? When we're in the Spanish-American War and stuff, we're seen as global leaders, but it takes on a whole new dynamic once we're out of World War II, largely because of the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, U.S. investment with the Marshall Plan, that kind of thing. And then you have increasing globalization, a World Trade Organization, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Those things begin to encourage global trade, the idea being that if we're all trading partners, we won't go to war with each other. And so you start to have some really significant changes. One of the big ones, of course, is going to be the division of Germany into zones, and of course, the division of Korea into North and South Korea. So that's a pretty short kind of discussion. Like I said, I'm not going to go into all the battles. I do want to point out women's service in World War II, whether it's in those in with the military, nurses, radio operators, map readers, cartographers, whatever it is they could do in the military. Women are able to make the military a career. And then women serve in factories, and they're doing manual work and factory work and that kind of thing. And it just changes the way women see themselves. Now, you will have that temporary retreat in the 1950s because of the baby boom. But you really see women as a part of this war effort. And so women who can vote and all that kind of thing, and what a difference that makes. And this is going to be true for African-American women as well as white women, as well as Latino women. So it really kind of includes a whole lot of people. Really short and sweet. There's not a whole lot that's complicated about this period of history in one sense, in the sense that we can talk about cause and effect, and it's really pretty straightforward. Where it's going to start to get complicated is after World War II, as we really start to look at, as women remember their experience in World War I, and they begin to move forward and say, wait a minute, right? We want to have those new opportunities. We want to have equal rights. We want to have all those things. So really what we've seen throughout the 20s and 30s and World War II is kind of women maybe kind of a retreat might be a little strong, but kind of falling to the background a little bit, like they got the right to vote and, what now? And so that's very much kind of a part of what's happening, I think. And so there's a lot of big kind of elements taking place with the Great Depression and with World War II. And those stories really overwhelm the female experience, right? So that there are specific stories there. And I shared in the weekly materials some primary documents for you to look at that are specific to women's experiences during this time. So feel free to look at those and maybe kind of get a little bit more out of it. But in a nutshell, I think this kind of gives you the basics of what you need to know. So when you're talking about, how do women participate in this particular time period? You're talking about, in World War II, they're volunteering. In the military, they're serving, they're helping to keep things going here at home. So they're actively, engaged in this war mentality and conserving and rationing and all this kind of stuff. So women are engaged in participating to promote our success in World War II. You're talking about the New Deal. You have women actively responding to kind of these economic conditions, trying to hold things together. And that picture of the migrant mother, of course, kind of says it all, right? So while women are not taking these kind of lead dominant roles, you definitely see women responding to the economic crisis of the time. And then if you look at the 1920s, you're talking about women who are responding to kind of new freedoms and new opportunities, right? So you could really almost kind of break this into, the 1920s is very much a social response, as a response to, I want new opportunities. I want to dance. I want to party. I want to drink. I want to be a flapper. I'm going to do all these different kind of things. Or alternatively, I'm going to be traditionalist and I might join the KKK, right? So these are social changes that take place in the 1920s. The 1930s, it's very much about a kind of economic participation. How do we respond to this economic crisis? Well, we try to hold things together, right? We try to keep things going. And then when you talk about World War II, you're talking about what is really kind of almost a political response, right? I'm going to get engaged in this war effort. I'm going to support the country. I'm going to do these things. So, women respond in ways that are not as dramatic as say getting the 19th Amendment, but they are nonetheless crucial to the success of the country. So hopefully that kind of helps you write your essay, even though, there's not as much interesting stuff to really deep dive in. But I hope you wrote down any questions you might have, whether it's about women or not, that we can go over next time we have a face-to-face class, or, be sure and email me and I'll try to answer your question. So thank you. We'll see you in a couple weeks.